So you're thinking about buying a franchise. You should probably be thinking in the home service industry. And in this video, we're going to go over going over what the difference is between a brick and mortar type franchise versus a home service. Then we'll go into who would do well with the home service franchise. And then 3, after your home service franchise is up and running, how to grow and expand. So just to get started with the differences between a home service franchise and a brick and mortar, the first is the initial startup. Because with a brick and mortar location, the reason why it might not be as good of an option for a first-time franchisee, it's usually a much higher investment because you have prime real estate that you have to be, on Main Street for, so that's more rent. There's usually a build out, which can be a few $100,000 up to $1 million or more in order to get done. And C, you don't have as much influence on the actual business growth itself. So those are the 3 high-level reasons. And Dill, if you want to add anything on there.
Yeah, operation costs are going to be different because you're committing to a long-term lease that you're personally guaranteeing, usually with no asset besides, just the actual business itself. So you have to consider that if you're going the brick and mortar route, right? Because you're building something out that you're just leasing, right? Theoretically, as opposed to most home services, if there's some sort of truck or car, that's just an asset-based loan or lease. So a little easier to not only get started, but also easier in terms of operational cost. So that's something to consider. And then also time, right? If there's a build out, hopefully it's 3 to 6 months, but sometimes it's 9 plus. So the lag time between you purchasing your franchise rights, training, and then actually getting not only build out, but all your permits done and everything started, it may be much longer to launch for a brick and mortar as opposed to a home service. So those are some key differences that you want to consider if you're looking at both.
Yeah, and not to say that a brick and mortar location, you don't learn business skills, because obviously you do. But I think if you're transitioning out of a W-2 job and you're going into business ownership, there's a lot of intangible skill sets that you'll have to learn being a business owner. And I think home services give you the ability to learn sales, to learn marketing, to learn operational management in a much more tangible aspect, because you're growing a team essentially from nothing. When you have the brick and mortar location, you are starting with a building, and maybe you can leverage some of the intangibles based off of that. But really having the ability to inject yourself into the business and really make it grow, I think provides a lot of a foundation to then expand into other businesses.
Yeah, now of course the reverse is true too, is that the one advantage of brick and mortar is there is a site. So you do just have simply people walking by, just pure foot traffic, old-fashioned, right? Or online foot traffic, so to speak. Hey, looking for X near me. You do have an advantage. Now, home services has an aspect of that, but the one thing about brick and mortar is there is a location. So to your point, I do think it's maybe more of a closer to scratch with home service, right? But it does give you that advantage of kind of crawling before you walk, walking before you run, and then you can get after it. So it's a little easier to sort of start slow, and you can kind of build those skills along the way, as opposed to if you have a brick and mortar, like you said, there's just more going on and it's already there. You got to make that that monthly nut, so to speak. But you have the advantage of there's a site specifically. So.
Yeah, exactly. And with the brick and mortar, you just have more overhead naturally. And one of the main things for someone who's starting a business for the first time is going to be, how do I do this as, considering longevity, how do I do this sustainably? And not having the pressure to fill such a big monthly nut can allow you to be a little bit more relaxed and enjoy the experience more and enjoy the build versus having all that pressure day one of needing to produce sales. A lot of the home service brands that we represent, they can be started as an owner-operator, where maybe not a one-man show, but closer to a one-man show, and you can really get an idea of how the business works. You don't have a huge overhead that you have to hit in order to make some money with, so you can get to profitability a little bit sooner, and then grow from there. So it allows for a nice transition period into that business ownership.
Yeah, and while no business has, technically unlimited capacity, right? You probably have to invest something in growth. There is an advantage to a home service that while you need more equipment, you're not maybe maxed out in the way you might be on a square footage basis for a location, right? If you're, say, a service-based brick and mortar, like a massage area, right? You can only do so much in, your 4 rooms, right? You only have so much time. You need another location once you hit that certain point, where with a home service, theoretically, as long as you have more people in trucks or whatever that equipment requires, if the business is there in the territory, you have a more unlimited capacity to get to in your territory. So that's another advantage, right? You can kind of start small, and over 3, 5, 8, 10 years, you could potentially grow every single year, where you may not be able to grow that top line the same way with a brick and mortar, because you just hit a point where, okay, well, now we're maxed out. Like, we just don't have enough room.
Yeah, exactly. And that shows also in the territory that you're given with a brick and mortar versus a home service based business. With a brick and mortar, sometimes the territory can be blocks in a city environment.
Yeah, more blue chip, it may literally be block by block.
Yeah, and for you, maybe you're more forgiving territories with a brick and mortar, it might be a mile or 2 radius, but you're definitely not going to get whole counties more than likely, unless you're paying a lot in franchise fee to buy the rights to there.
Sure.
Versus a home service, you typically are buying a population of at least 200,000 people.
Sometimes 500,000.
Yeah,
exactly. Up to, it could be a whole county, to your point. So you really can own that area, so to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah, great point.
So then transitioning into who would do well with a home service, or how to do well with a home service franchise. So I think to start this part of the conversation, it's important to break down that at the core of virtually every home service business, it's broken down into 2 main parts: sales and operations. So the one reason why I like home services for a first-time franchise buyer is because, typically speaking, most people that we work with, when we do our initial vision call, we talk about, what does the person want to do with the business? What are their skill sets? What do they enjoy? And for me, at least, what I find is most people either fall into one of 2 buckets. They either say, I really like the sales process. I don't really want to manage a big team. I'd rather just have a lean, mean team that I can direct, and I enjoy building a sales team that can just go out and hunt. And then in the other bucket are individuals who say, I'm not really that sales oriented, but I'm really operationally focused, and I want to manage a lot of people and really build a culture within the building. The nice thing about home service franchises, they're typically designed for the owner to fill one or of those roles. So you can fill both, of course, but with all the models that we represent, for the most part, you can fill one of those roles primarily and then hire for the other side. So for your sales type person, you can be the sales driver. You can focus on building that sales team and have an operations person put in somewhat early on to really run the day-to-day and make sure crews are going out. And the opposite is also true, where you can, if you're more operationally focused, you can more so have someone on the sales side and then manage the operation.
Yeah, and part of what we do, and we have an advantage because we built a business that did moving and junk removal, is we've seen both sides of it, because home service is a wide vertical, right? There's a lot of different angles. And Hermosi said, and this is true, there's a continuum of sales to fulfillment, right? So to give everyone a background, when we did moving, it was much easier to sell because it was much harder to fulfill. So you needed an operational mindset to get the crews out there to make sure they did a good job of moving people from home to home. But it was easier to sell because there was a lot of demand and it was harder to fulfill. And the reverse was true for our junk removal business, where it was very difficult to sell because there was a lot of competition. And, it's a service that no one necessarily needs to the level they do with moving, but it was a lot easier to fulfill. You didn't need the operational chops to get, a crew out there and trained to, remove stuff people are just throwing away. So part of what we do too, when we're talking to people, and people should consider, and why they should look at home services franchises, is because, one, you may have painting, which requires quite a bit of sales chops, but if it's using, say, a subcontractor labor model, it's more of a project management operational side, as opposed to businesses that, like restoration, where not that there aren't any sales skills required, but if you're with the right franchise, they develop a lot of those relationships for you or help you to establish those. But it's 24/7 emergency services, so you better be good at managing people, leading teams, and so part of what we do is help people to, see which way they lean, but also understand the effects of both, because just something with a high demand, service that has great margins, but they like to sell things, may not be perfect for them if it's, hey, you need to be you're always recruiting, you're always hiring, you got to be a people person. You're not out there hunting as opposed to other businesses that may suit that. So there's you have to understand which way you lean too, right? Because I think there's it's like being an offensive or defensive coach, right? Like if you're defensive minded, you have to go one way. If you're offense, you have to go the other. So,
yeah, exactly. And that's one of the other reasons why I really like home services for a first time franchise buyer, because there's so many different aspects to home service, and you could have two brands in the same industry that fundamentally different types of people will do well in each one, because one's more geared towards sales and the other one's more geared towards operations. So the amount of options that you have within the home service space allows you to be a little bit more customizable to match with your skill set. So if you are someone who really likes high pressure, intense sales with big ticket items and that doesn't scare you at all, we have options for that. If you're someone who says, I like more consultative sales where I don't have to necessarily get all the sales tactics, but I can present the information in a way where it's receptive to the customer and help them make the best decision, you can do that. On an operational side, I want a smaller, lean team that doesn't have to, I don't have to build to 100 people in order to do well. You have that option. So there's a ton of different options within the home service space that makes it a little bit easier to fine-tune exactly what's going to be a good fit for you.
Yeah, and I think the other part of it too is what those skills mean in the short term, because to your point, if this is your first business and your first franchise, you want to make sure, you're kind of geared to what's a priority there, but then also what's your long-term priority. Because some businesses do maybe have, I don't want to say a max capacity, but there's only so much potential business in the area, right? And you have to understand what your long-term growth looks like. Some franchise systems and just business models don't have the potential to be $10 million businesses, and some do. So understanding what your short and long-term goals are also important. And if you're looking, you should evaluate that alongside with your skill set.
Yeah, 100% agree. And that's a good transition into our third point in how do you then, after you have an established home service business, what do you do from there? How do you grow?
Yeah.
There's a few different avenues in which you can do so. The first of which is probably the most innate to think about is you just grow your team and you expand operations. Because again, just like we mentioned before, you buy a larger territory, you're starting small, and then you're building out. So the first way to grow it is to maximize whatever territory you purchase by increasing the trucks, if that's what's included in your business, and the technicians that are out and servicing those trucks.
Yeah, definitely, of course. Yeah, you can just reinvest into, more capacity so that you can sell more. And the advantage of being with a franchise system, particularly one that's been established, is you can talk to people that have done it. So you're not on your own trying to just throw money out and making these wild projections that may not match up what's reality. So that's an advantage you have. So of course, you can reinvest in capacity. That's one way. The other option, of course, is to expand market, right? You can add an additional territory. And there's two ways to do that. You can add a new territory, which is just doing what you're doing, hopefully adjacent to your territory and expanding that market, or potentially acquiring.
Yep.
Right. So if there's a neighboring territory or a non-neighboring territory, depending on what sort of operational capacity you have, you can buy, one of your neighbors in the same system, and now you have acquired their business as well, and you build that into your operations.
Yeah, exactly. Now let's assume a situation where you've maxed out your territory, all the other surrounding territories are sold out with your given brand, and they're not looking to sell, so you can't necessarily expand that way. Another way that you can expand your business portfolio is an option that we know of in the industry called brand stacking.
Right.
And the concept of brand stacking is saying, okay, well, at the core, home services are home services. There's nuances between each one, but once you understand the sales process of a home service and then the fulfillment of a home service, it's easier to copy and paste that into other industries, especially if they relate. So if you have a moving business, right, and you're maxed out of your territory, something that you could pack onto that or attach onto that could be a cleaning service. Because if you're moving, you probably want to get your old house clean so it looks well, and then your new house clean because you want a fresh start.
Yeah.
That's true for painting. Any other services that are revolving around the home sales process, that's a good way to think about the brand stacking aspect.
Yeah, and especially if they're under their same umbrella, if they're like a conglomerate or some sort of corporate structure where they're, under the same umbrella, you can potentially even use the same or similar software. A lot of times you can have the same general manager, right? So you benefit from economies of scale along with, of course, sharing customers and relationships. People that are listening are probably familiar. They see this with franchises on a brick and mortar scale, right? Like you might see a KFC and a Taco Bell when they're connected, right? So similar, right? Same building, they're paying one rent, right, for the location, and people go in and maybe buy one and also buy the other, right? Yeah. Especially if you're in college and hungry type of thing. So yeah, but it's similar with the home services to your point of brand stacking, and this is important. Especially if you're landlocked in terms of territory, or if you're just in a market where an adjacent territory isn't viable, right? Say you're in a more rural area, you don't want to go to an area where there's not a lot of business. You can say, all right, well, I already know property managers and realtors, like you said, for the moving business. Well, now I can say, by the way, we do cleaning, and we can offer maybe a discount or some sort of package that allows you to expand that way, right? So you hit your capacity with one business, right, or one model, and then you can expand in the other, and then they tend to help each other grow because you get business from one that feeds the other and so on.
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring up about why home services are good for someone who's looking for their first franchise, because you've already built all the relationships with the realtors, the property managers, whoever's using your services now. It's an easy database to just tap into to say, hey, we also do this other service, and it's not guaranteed business, but probably have a little bit more of a warm lead pool just based off of the customers that you already have. And then another point that you brought up is especially within the same parent company or conglomerate. So parent companies like Authority Brands, Neighborly, they all have multiple brands under their portfolio. They use the same softwares. For Neighborly, I know they have an app that a lot of their franchisees will push their customers, and in that app, they can see the other brands that are in there. So if you hire, Rainbow Restoration, which is a Neighborly brand, you get the app, and then you look in there and you say, oh, there's Shelf Genie. That's another brand. It's like, oh, they do shelf or cabinet refittings with slide-out shelving. That's cool. Like, let me just get a quote from them. Automatically goes to the local franchisee. And if you own both, well, you just tapped into that market. Also,
another way to expand, you could acquire, if someone's already in your market doing that additional service, you could just acquire their business and, potentially take over. That's a great way to do it. Another thing that not all, and we were using the phrase home service, but home service can also mean service. Commercial is another huge aspect that most services want you to do, but they understand it takes time to develop the infrastructure, particularly to do the large scale jobs. So that's another way you can expand, is growing that commercial division, going after bigger jobs that other just pure competitors can't even handle, right? Especially with the benefit of a franchise system, you have people that have done it within the network that you can tap. So that's another way, right? As you say, okay, it's a home service, but for example, painting, not just houses need to be painted, right? There's also large commercial buildings that could be, 5-6 figure jobs plus that, need that service. So that's another way you can grow alongside additional territory and services.
Yep. And then I'd say the last one is, if those aren't of interest and you as you're going through your entrepreneurial journey, there's a different business that you want to do, maybe even outside of franchising, having the franchisor be able to say, okay, if you want this business to run what we call semi-absentee, which means you're not having to be involved in the day-to-day, here's what the management structure has to look like, here's the KPIs you need to manage, and leveraging that allows you the freedom to then go off into pretty much any other direction that you want to. That business, maybe it's capped out, but you can optimize it to then free up as much of your time as possible, and then you could do whatever else you want after that. So it kind of opens up that possibility. After you get that established base, you ask the franchisor, how do I make this semi-absentee? What do I need to have in place? And you go from there.
Yeah, and not exclusively, but we've definitely heard about 3 times multiple. So even just on an exit strategy, if you want to sell, you can, home service franchises right now are very popular because they're hard to offshore, and they're they're hard to, as it stands, replace with technology. Someone's got to come fix the HVAC in your house. Someone's got to do the plumbing. So not that it's guaranteed that's what you'll sell yours for, but that's what we tend to see. So even if your expansion strategy is, hey, I'm going to do this for a period of time, and then if I want to leave and expand into other things personally, That tends to be what we see. But yeah, to your point, those are great ways you can expand.
Yep. Yeah, so that gives you an idea about why we like home services as a general industry for first-time franchise buyers. And anything else?
No. I think it's if it's your first opportunity, if it's your first business, I think everyone should at least look at services because they tend to be lower investment. And if you have a business acumen, franchise home services can be a great way to at least get your feet wet with much lower initial investment than some of our other brick and mortar options.
Perfect. Well, until next time.
Cool.